The growing trend in sports nutrition is that every athlete's body is unique. At the Gatorade Sports Science Institute, we are working to help athletes and their influencers better understand these differences so they can better fuel their bodies. GSSI has a variety of tools to accomplish this, from testing the unique attributes of each athlete to nutrition personalization programs and educational outreach. GSSI is striving to make sure athletes and their influencers are more informed about their nutritional needs than ever before. GSSI is also an educational resource for sports health professionals, athletic trainers, strength and conditioning coaches, registered dietitians and sports scientists all turn to GSSI to gain insights into the latest research and strategies that they can put to use with their own athletes. Whether it's in the lab or on the field, online or offline, GSSI is giving athletes and their influencers an invaluable look at how nutrition and hydration can change their game, help them reach their goals, and become the best they can be.
So hi everyone, welcome to the second edition of the GSSI Fuel School. To those of you that attended the first webinar, thank you for joining, and to all the new attendees, it's a pleasure to have you with us this afternoon or evening, depending on where you're joining us from. So for those of you that don't know me, I am Rebecca Randall. I've been with the Gatorade Sports Science Institute for 8 years and I'm currently a senior scientist. I'll be moderating the session again and I'll be asking the speakers questions, so we'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions throughout the hour, just type them into the Q&A box and we'll try and answer as many as possible. To give you a bit of background about GSSI, our long-standing mission is to help athletes optimise their health and performance through research and education in hydration and nutrition science. And we work under 4 main pillars, which are education, research, innovation, and athlete service. So these webinars are related to our education pillar with the aim to educate more sports professionals than ever. And as we can't meet in person due to these challenging times, this virtual platform is a great way to provide sports nutrition presentations. So today we have another great lineup. We'll be hearing 2 fantastic talks focusing on the topic of Fuel for Performance by Dr. Tom Clifford and Dr. Ian Rollo. The format will be the same. Each speaker will have 20 minutes and we should hopefully have some time after both speakers have presented for question and answers. So let's begin. Our first speaker today is Dr. Tom Clifford. Tom holds a BSc in Sports and Exercise Science and an MSc in Sports Performance. In 2017, Tom completed his PhD in Exercise and Health Nutrition at Northumbria University, and he recently joined Loughborough University as a lecturer in Physiology and Nutrition. Today, Tom is going to talk about carbohydrate for sports performance. So thanks for joining us today, Tom, and we're looking forward to hearing your presentation. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Rebecca, for the introduction, and also to GSSI for the opportunity to speak today. So, as Rebecca mentioned, I'm going to talk about the topic of carbohydrates for sports performance. So, controlled laboratory studies related to carbohydrate intake during exercise began to be published in the 1980s. In the slides here, you can see figures from studies by Coyle et al., who demonstrated that blood glucose concentrations dropped to very low levels towards the end of exercise, when subjects exercised at 70% to exhaustion over 3 hours. However, when study participants were fed glucose during exercise, blood glucose concentrations and total carbohydrate oxidation rates were maintained, and this prolonged time to exhaustion by 1 hour. Over the years, published research has accumulated to look at types, amounts, performance outcomes, and much of that work has been done in endurance type exercise. Overall, in most activities, most of the time, carbohydrates will be the predominant energy source. In preparation for daily training sessions, an athlete should focus on a carbohydrate-rich diet. The exact amounts that the athlete should consume can be tailored based on the individual athlete's total energy needs and also their training session needs. These recommendations are meant to provide high carbohydrate availability, i.e. they're supposed to have the amount of carbohydrates needed to top up the muscle liver glycogen stores and also to support the central nervous system. And this is important for different exercise loads and different scenarios, where it's important to exercise with high quality and/or high intensity. More specifically, an athlete can further tailor carbohydrate intake in the pre, during, and post-training scenarios. Over the years, a large body of literature has been developed around endurance exercise. In general, when compared with placebo ingestion during exercise longer than 2 hours, carbohydrate feeding will do a number of things. It will prevent hypoglycemia, maintain high rates of carbohydrate oxidation, delay the onset of fatigue, reduce ratings of perceived exertion, and increase endurance capacity. Intermittent high-intensity exercise, such as soccer, basketball, and hockey, rely on carbohydrates as their fuel. 10 out of 12 studies found improved intermittent exercise capacity with carbohydrate versus placebo. This finding is perhaps not surprising given the well-established benefit of carbohydrate intake on endurance exercise capacity. 3 out of 4 studies in basketball report a benefit of carbohydrate ingestion on sprint speed in the fourth quarter of a simulated game. However, only 1 study out of 5 reported a benefit of carbohydrate ingestion on jumping. 2 of the 4 soccer studies report a benefit of carbohydrate ingestion on agility. Both basketball studies and the singles tennis study report a benefit too. The single study in rugby reported no benefit. Non-specific studies report mixed results, with 1 reporting a benefit. However, there is limited data generally on agility, which is really difficult to measure. There is evidence of a beneficial effect of carbohydrate on soccer skills, such as shooting and dribbling. In soccer, 6 of 8 studies have reported improved skill performance of carbohydrate ingestion. Mixed results have been found in basketball. 1 study reported improved performance, 1 study reported no effect of carbohydrate intake. In racket sports, 3 studies reported improved performance, 4 studies reported no effect of carbohydrate intake. However, again, like agility, skill is difficult to measure and many different tests have been used. There does need to be some more validation work for the measurement of skill in sports. Carbohydrate intake has an impact when athletes are fatigued as well. So this slide highlights a study using a simulated basketball game model. Athletes were provided 41 grams per hour of carbohydrates. They completed a shuttle run to fatigue, and they were found to have a faster 20-meter sprint, higher jump height, and improved motor skills in the fourth quarter. However, carbohydrate did not improve vertical jump, cognitive function, or POMS composite score. So in summary, for intermittent sports, there is some evidence that carbohydrate ingestion can improve performance. At present, there is no research in batting sports, but given the intermittent nature of the sport and related physiology, we can make some extrapolation that carbohydrates will likely be important for them as well. Possible mechanisms of exercise capacity enhancement include sparing of glycogen resynthesis during low-intensity exercise periods, and attenuated effort perception during exercise. Carbohydrates provide a metabolic advantage, so they make sure you have high carbohydrate oxidation, they help to spare liver glycogen. When we choose types of carbs, we want to choose those that result in high rates of oxidation. The point here is, when choosing carbohydrates during exercise, we need to think about how fast they are used by the body. On the screen shows carbohydrates as sugars, some that are more rapidly and some that are more slowly digested. Those that are more rapidly digested result in higher carbohydrate oxidation. So we can also classify carbohydrates as simple and complex. But instead, we should think about carbohydrates as fast and slow, not simple and complex. Some slow carbohydrates are okay. There is a transporter for fructose, for example. This is known as GLUT5, and hopefully you can see this here on the screen. But generally, fructose is absorbed slower than glucose. Glucose, as you can hopefully see on the screen at the top, is absorbed via the SGLT1 transporter. This transporter will saturate at about a rate of 1 gram per minute or 60 grams per hour of carbohydrate. Now, fructose, if ingested on its own, is incompletely absorbed and can cause gastrointestinal distress. Malabsorption of fructose is reduced significantly, though, when it's consumed with glucose, but the mechanism for this is not well understood. This study on the screen examined fructose and glucose co-ingestion during prolonged exercise. Glucose and fructose together result in a 7% increase in total carbohydrate oxidation, including increased lactate production. The bottom line, although fructose is not a fast carbohydrate per se, it shouldn't be ignored. So to summarize the past few slides into recommendations, when performance especially is an athlete's goal, you want to look at 3 to 4 hours before practice or competition to consume 1 to 4 grams per kilo of carbohydrates. This is obviously quite a big range, so it's important to find the amount and the timing that's going to suit you best. In the hour before, you should try and have a small amount of easily digested carbohydrates. Something like 23 grams would be a good example, and this can help meet your training needs. During practice or competition, again, you should try and consume around 30 to 60 grams an hour of carbohydrates when going for at least 60 minutes. After practice or competition, to make sure that you can replenish carbohydrates dose optimally, you should try and consume about 1 to 1.2 grams per kilo of carbohydrates. And this is going to be especially important if you're doing double training sessions and you've got a shorter time to recover, so say less than 8 hours. More specifically, 30 to 60 grams per hour should be consumed during exercise for a team sport, and up to 90 grams an hour during endurance exercise of more than 2.5 hours. Of course, these are quite high, so we don't want to recommend athletes get to this range all at once if they aren't currently consuming amounts similar to this, or if they're consuming very little. It's best to start off slow, get to the right amount slowly over time, and this is the best way to avoid any gastrointestinal distress. It's possible though, and it's probably going to be necessary to get to these amounts to train the gut. So just to summarize this presentation on carbohydrates and sports performance. So carbohydrates is a primary fuel for us. It improves endurance performance and also predictors of team sports performance. It's best to try and choose carbohydrates that are oxidized quickly, and this includes the sugars, glucose, and sucrose. These are best consumed during training and competition because they're rapidly digested. To get the most from carbohydrates, you should consume them before, during, and after exercise, so competition or training, and this is especially important when performance is your main goal. Thank you very much for signing in today and taking the time to listen through my talk, and I look forward to any questions you might have at the end of this.
Thanks, Tom. Great presentation, super clear, and I think it gives some really great practical recommendations for people working in endurance and team sports. So let's move on to the next talk. Again, if you've got any questions for Tom or Ian, just pop them into the Q&A box. But let's move on to Ian and we'll do the questions at the end. So Ian is the head of GSSI International. He's an honorary research fellow at Loughborough University and is an SCNR applied practitioner. His current role involves providing nutritional support for professional soccer clubs. He's worked with FC Barcelona for the last 5 years, where he leads the club's online certificate for sports nutrition for football, and has worked with Manchester City for the last 4 seasons. Ian has over 30 publications in peer-reviewed journals and continues to deliver invited presentations globally. Ian's going to talk to us today on carbohydrate mouth rinse, a primary mechanism. So Ian, that's ready for you.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Dr. Clifford, for a great presentation and really setting the scene for my talk on carbohydrate mouth rinse, a primary effect. Next slide, please. Before I start the presentation, I'd like to encourage you to think about the last time you were hungry. How did it make you feel? How was your mood? Then think about when you were finally next able to eat. When did you begin to feel better? Was it when the food had been digested and absorbed and the nutrients entered the circulation? Or did you feel better following that first bite when the food entered your mouth? As it is in the mouth where carbohydrate may exert a primary effect on exercise performance, which we will discuss today. So please hold it on this slide. Carbohydrate ingestion has long been known to improve endurance capacity. The ingested carbohydrate maintains the supply of glucose to the working muscles and prolongs exercise duration by maintaining carbohydrate oxidation required to sustain exercise intensity. So in summary, carbohydrate ingestion is relevant during prolonged exercise, where the body's store of carbohydrate, glycogen, will gradually be depleted and become limiting to exercise performance. Next slide, please. However, the ingestion of carbohydrate has also been found to improve shorter, more intense cycling and running performance, approximately 1 hour in duration. During exercise of this duration and intensity, the body's store of carbohydrate is unlikely to be limited. Blood glucose is well maintained, and thus improvements in performance are somewhat surprising given that there appears to be little metabolic rationale for providing carbohydrate during exercise. But intriguingly, at a similar time, studies were investigating the effect of infusing carbohydrate directly into the circulation during exercise. And these studies reported no benefit to endurance performance. And it was the discrepancy between these observations that highlighted the difference between those studies that reported benefits of carbohydrate ingestion and those that did not, was the method by which carbohydrate entered the body. Specifically, the infusion method bypassed the gastrointestinal tract. Next slide, please. And it was these observations that led to the seminal carbohydrate mouth rinse study, which was completed by Dr. James Carter, who, it now happens, is the director of the Gatorade Sports Science Institute. And in this study, trained cyclists completed a 40-kilometer time trial in which they simply mouth rinsed a maltodextrin solution or water before expectorating the solution, thereby avoiding the ingestion of carbohydrate. And amazingly, this led to an improvement in performance of 2.9% on the carbohydrate mouth rinse trial. Next slide, please. A follow-up study by Dr. Ed Chambers in the same research group replicated these findings using both a sweet glucose and a non-sweet maltodextrin solution, with similar improvements in performance, 2 to 3%. But this study also attempted to understand how carbohydrate in the mouth could exert an effect on performance. So on a separate occasion, under resting conditions, Dr. Chambers asked participants to mouth rinse carbohydrate solutions under a functional MRI scanner. Next slide, please. And interestingly, they found that carbohydrate in the mouth activated areas in the brain associated with reward and motor activity. Though it is important to note that the carbohydrate beverage used in the scan was far more concentrated than that was being used during exercise. Next slide, please. At a similar time, Milu Belan and colleagues at Maastricht University replicated the original time trial used in the first carbohydrate mouth rinse study. But in this investigation, participants were fed a carbohydrate-rich meal 3 hours before exercise and reported no benefit of mouth rinsing carbohydrate to performance versus a placebo. So why could that be? Next slide, please. Well, this slide shows results from Haas et al. Published in Neuroimage back in 2009. This study investigated the brain's activity in response to feeding nutrients either when participants were hungry or fed, so following a meal. And they found a greater brain activity in the fasted state. Next slide, please. So in response to the literature, Stephen Lane and colleagues completed this excellent study to investigate the impact of pre-carbohydrate status and carbohydrate mouth rinse on cycling performance. On 4 separate occasions, participants completed a 60-minute time trial, either fed, mouth rinsing a carbohydrate beverage, fed or mouth rinsing a placebo, fasted and mouth rinsing carbohydrate, or fasted and mouth rinsing a placebo. So reading these results right to left, in the fasted state, similar to previous studies, carbohydrate mouth rinse improved performance by 3.4%. Performance was similar to when participants consumed a carbohydrate-rich meal and mouth rinsed placebo. However, the best performance was achieved by feeding participants and mouth rinsing carbohydrate. Next slide, please. So these were intriguing results, but the research I've discussed so far all involves cycle exercise. My particular interest was in running. The first published study to investigate carbohydrate mouth rinse on running performance was completed by Whittam and McKinney back in 2007, who reported no benefit when routinely mouth rinsing carbohydrate during a 45-minute time trial, in which the aim was to complete as great a distance as possible. However, please note that this trial was completed on a manual treadmill, where runners had to press buttons to control their running speed. And we felt that such a method may not be sensitive to detect the small differences or benefits to performance that mouth rinsing carbohydrate may induce. Next slide, please. Next. So in response, we developed a novel protocol using an automated treadmill, in which the running speed could be modified depending on the runner's position on the treadmill belt. Next. So as the runner moved forward, the treadmill belt would accelerate. If they moved back, it would decelerate. And if they stayed in the middle, stay the same speed. And using this new tool, we validated a 60-minute running protocol in which we asked runners to cover as much distance as possible in that time. Next slide, please. And next. So using this tool, we validated the 60-minute running protocol, and then using this method, we found that carbohydrate mouth rinsing before and routinely during exercise improved running performance by 1.5%. And this improvement was beyond the day-to-day variation of the testing protocol. Next slide, please. Now, more recently, we've investigated the impact of carbohydrate mouth rinse on intermittent running performance. In this study, we utilized the Loughborough intermittent shuttle run test, which replicates the running demands of football or soccer. Each block of the protocol involved running 20-meter shuttles to an audible cue, in which participants repeated a sequence of variable intensity running, involving a walk, a 15-meter sprint, jog, and a cruise or high-intensity run. And in this study, we asked participants to complete this sequence for 75 minutes. But for the last block, we asked participants to continue the pattern of running, but we removed the audio signals, so their efforts were self-paced or self-regulated. And in this final block 6, participants routinely mouth rinsed either with a 10% maltodextrin solution or placebo. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the results from the self-selected block 6, in which there was no difference in walking speeds. There was a trend, but no significant difference in sprint speeds or sprint velocity or cruising speeds. However, there was an improvement in self-selected jogging speed. So think about the benefits to those recovery runs to regain tactical positions following high-intensity efforts or sprints in the final 15 minutes of a football match. Next slide, please. I'm often asked what the concentration of the carbohydrate mouth rinse solution should be. And carbohydrate beverages used in studies typically range from 6 to 10%. But this slide shows the results of a study led by Dr. Lewis James at Loughborough University, which nicely demonstrates that there is no performance dose-response effect to carbohydrate concentration. Consistent with previous observations, mouth rinsing with a 7% carbohydrate solution improved cycle time trial performance versus placebo, but no further benefits to performance were reported when doubling the solution concentration to 14%. Next slide, please. Now, around this time, athletes and colleagues were approaching me and saying, okay, so we don't need to drink the carbohydrate beverage. We just need to mouth rinse and expectorate the solution. But this is not how I was thinking about this effect. So we completed a study in which we compared carbohydrate mouth rinse to mouth rinse and ingestion to carbohydrate mouth rinse alone, or the mouth rinse and ingestion of a placebo solution during 1 hour running performance. And in our hands, we found that mouth rinsing and ingesting a carbohydrate beverage was superior to mouth rinsing carbohydrate or the mouth rinse and ingestion of a placebo. And that is why my presentation is entitled A Primary Effect, because it is simply the first point at which carbohydrate may exert or impact performance before being digested and absorbed for processing by the body. Next slide, please. And this slide attempts to summarize my understanding on how carbohydrates' presence in the mouth during exercise may impact on exercise performance. At the onset of exercise, the athlete is presented with a task. That could be a distance to run or time to complete. The ability to complete that task will be influenced by the environmental conditions, but mainly but also on the experience and training status of the individual. Mouth rinsing carbohydrate before and during activity may lower the perception of effort during exercise, allowing the athlete to exercise slightly harder than they would have done otherwise. It may also improve the motor recruitment of muscle required to complete that exercise task, consequently improving the task outcome. But the magnitude of this effect is likely to be influenced by the carbohydrate status of the individual, with the greatest effect seen in a carbohydrate depleted or compromised state. Next slide, please. So in summary, carbohydrate mouth rinse is most likely most applicable to endurance exercise. There are some early positive reports that it may benefit skill, but further research is needed. The majority of research has shown benefits to exercise 30 minutes to 1 hour in duration, to which mouth rinsing a carbohydrate beverage between 6 and 10% before and routinely during exercise for 5 to 10 seconds before expectorating the solution may be beneficial. And this method may be of particular interest to those athletes seeking a performance advantage that carbohydrate may provide, but has a history or may suffer from gastrointestinal complaint that Dr. Clifford spoke about previously. Next slide, please. I'd like to dedicate this talk to Professor David Jones, who passed away this year. Professor Jones was my undergraduate supervisor at Birmingham University. He was a giant in his field and really the true instigator for discovering this mouth rinse phenomenon. Next slide, please. Finally, I'd like to thank all those runners who participated in our studies. I'd like to thank Professor Clyde Williams, who provided the opportunity to complete these investigations at Loughborough University. And finally, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I welcome any questions.
Thanks so much, Ian, and it's really nice to see the dedication to Professor Jones, so thanks. We've had a few questions in, but again, we welcome any more, so please send them in if you have them. One question that we did have that came in, and I think, Ian, I think you have covered it, but it was around whether a higher percentage of carbohydrate would be more beneficial for mouth rinsing than a 6% solution. But from my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the study by Lewis James covered that.
Yes, it's a good question. There doesn't appear to be any dose response to carbohydrate ingestion, but also our palate changes during exercise, and so that in our studies at least, we've found that if we make the solution too concentrated, the runner doesn't like that perception or mouthfeel during exercise. So certainly around 6 to 10% seems to be the sweet spot.
Yes, and it's a really interesting point as well around like personalization and how we all have like different preferences of what we like to consume or rinse during exercise. And in kind of a similar topic in terms of personalization, Tom, or I was wondering if you could just clarify when you talk about the carbohydrate recommendations in grams per kilogram of body weight, should that be your current body weight, or is that really like the ideal body weight that you should base those recommendations off?
Yeah, it should be your current body weight. It's based very much on who you are at that present moment and what that intake should be given that exercise that you're going to do. So obviously that might fluctuate as your body weight would change. And elite athletes, a good example is endurance athletes, they won't be the same weight all year round. So it's important to make sure that you do fluctuate that intake to try and match what your current body weight is.
Great, thanks. And that, obviously that's just from looking at your slides, that's just the before and after recommendations. The during is more absolute values. So if we just carry on with a question for you, Tom, if that's okay, and thinking about this during exercise carbohydrate recommendations, does it matter what form of carbohydrate we ingest, whether that's beverage or some other form?
Yeah, no, the research suggests that there isn't really any difference. So if you're going to have a gel, food, drink, etc., it doesn't seem to make much of a difference to carbohydrate oxidation and performance outcomes as well. So it really is going to be up to the athlete, up to the individual on what's going to suit them best.
Great, thank you. So Ian, a couple of questions from you, if I could change the attention over to you in your presentation. You showed some studies done in endurance athletes and in intermittent type sports, such as football. Do you know of any studies that have been done with mouth rinsing in tennis?
Not tennis. I don't believe so. No, I can't think of any studies in tennis. I believe the last study looking at skill was in badminton players, in fact. But I need to go back and check that. But you know, tennis is an interesting sport where the duration and intensity of exercise ranges hugely depending from game to game or match to match. No, at the moment we need further, to extend these protocols into different sports. It's mainly based around continuous endurance-based exercise.
Yeah, and I guess with like tennis and badminton, there's more opportunity to ingest something in those types of sports because there's more breaks, whereas some of the team sports, such as like football, there's less opportunity to take on nutrients during the game specifically. If I
Sorry,
could,
just to build on that. Yeah, so the carbohydrate ingestion evidence there is for improved skill in tennis and in badminton if we think about racket sports. So this primary effect that we're discussing today may be applicable to those sports as well.
And just continuing with the carbohydrate mouth rinse studies, is there more of an effect, or is performance increased further if it's combined with other ingredients, so adding something to that carbohydrate?
Yeah, that is a really good question. At present, there are the two best candidates really to combine with carbohydrate are caffeine and menthol. Now, a recent consensus statement in sports medicine concluded that mouth rinsing with menthol may be an effective strategy especially to enhance performance when exercising in the heat. With regards to caffeine, then it's common for endurance athletes to train in a carbohydrate depleted state. And in this instance, mouth rinsing with a caffeinated beverage may reduce some of the decrements caused by carbohydrate reduction. But certainly further work is needed specifically to look at the additive effects of carbohydrate versus or carbohydrate in addition to other nutrition compounds of interest.
Thanks. And you touched on something there about often endurance athletes train in a fasted state. And Tom, maybe I'll direct this question to you, but it's often that athletes don't eat before training, or they don't feel like they want to eat, or the training's early, so they don't have time to eat. effects could that have on the following performance or the following practice?
Yeah, and I think it would depend on many factors. So I think if you're somebody who does struggle to eat before performance in the morning, then it might be important to make sure you're really fueled from the day before. So paying more attention to what foods you're having the night before, particularly. So making sure you have carbohydrate-rich meals. So at least in the morning, when it comes to whatever the performance is, then yes, you've probably lost some liver glycogen overnight, but hopefully your muscle glycogen stores are probably quite topped up still. So if whatever it is that you're doing is less than 60 minutes or maybe not too high intensity, then I don't think there'll be too much of an issue. You might get, say, a reduced perceived exertion, and part of that might be more psychological than physical. So that's one thing to consider. If, though, you are doing exercise that's very important for your performance, so a high intensity bout, something that you're looking to try and improve on, ready for competition, then that's where ideally you need to try and focus on it a bit more. And appreciate it's difficult when it comes to eating in the morning in terms of gastrointestinal stress or time, etc. So for anyone working with athletes in that situation, I would definitely encourage some kind of more personalized work with that athlete to try and see what they might be able to get on board so they can help improve their performance. So could it be that they can manage 10 to 15, 20 grams of a small carbohydrate beverage? Maybe it's a gel, maybe it's a few sweets, something like that. But I would definitely try and work on anything you can do if the performance, if that training session is really important for your competition goals, is to try and maximize your opportunity of performing your best by trying to have some carbohydrates beforehand.
Thanks
Yeah, and
very
if I
much.
may
That's
just,
great. Yeah, sure, go for it.
yeah, no, I think it's a really good points, and I think as to Tom's presentation, that practicing those strategies are so important, but also with regards to the timing, a common mistake is to eat too close to exercise. So allowing sufficient time from that pre-exercise feedings to starting exercise is really important.
Thanks, Ian. And we've had a few questions in for the carbohydrate mouth rinse. So would an endurance athlete choose to mouth rinse over ingesting carbohydrate, given the benefit of ingesting carbohydrate?
It may depend on the exercise duration and the intensity. We forget that the carbohydrate sports beverages have a dual benefit. They don't just provide fuel, but they also provide fluids. And we learned from our first webinar last week the importance of trying to reduce the degree of dehydration experience during exercise. So when we ingest sports beverages, we have the dual benefit, if you like, of providing carbohydrate for fuel, potentially getting the central effect from the mouth rinse or carbohydrate recognition in the mouth, but then also the delivery of fluids to the body. So that shouldn't be forgotten.
I think that probably goes back to one of the previous questions as well about the form that the carbohydrate should be in. Yeah, we can ingest carbohydrate in different forms, but we also shouldn't neglect the importance of hydration as well. And then a similar question, can you use mouth rinse over ingestion in an ongoing competition? So for example, in basketball?
I think it goes back to that previous point. You still want to encourage, and at least in our hands, we would encourage the ingestion over mouth rinse. And the mouth rinse effects that we see is actually an additional benefit of carbohydrate ingestion. Now, people may then argue that you might towards the end of exercise, you might not benefit from carbohydrate ingestion because it would take too long to be digested and absorbed and used in the muscles, as Tom's alluded to. However, our work would suggest that even late in exercise, if you can mouth rinse the beverage before ingestion, you may still get that last performance benefit, which could impact on the outcome of a basketball game.
And I think with team sports, there's lots of factors that you have to think about, like competition being one. Maybe if you're playing multiple games throughout a day, like you've got to consider refueling and ready to go for your next match. And I think another thing that needs to be considered with team sports is substitutes. So they obviously sit, for football, for example, they sit on the bench for a lot of the game and then they come on for maybe 10, 15 minutes. So, Tom, what would you say about the recommendations for substitutes? Like, should they be following the guidelines while they're sat on the bench, or should it be tailored depending on when they might come on?
Yeah, I think it should definitely be tailored. I think it's so hard in team sports. It can be so dynamic. So due to injuries, a player could expect maybe not to come on at all or just get the last 10 minutes, but they could end up playing 80 minutes. So in terms of making sure they're ready in that kind of scenario, then really anything up towards that match, they kind of want to make sure they are fueling appropriately, as if, you know, something might occur and they are going to have to come on and perform for quite a significant amount of time. So that does make it quite a challenge, I think, when it comes to substitutes. Of course, though, if we're looking at the rule of anything over around 60 minutes is when you want to try and be upping your carbohydrate intake around 30 to 60 grams per hour, then obviously a substitute who's only going to be playing 10 to 15 minutes probably doesn't have to worry too much about that compared to somebody who's playing 90 minutes. And obviously the same with refueling as well. If you've only played, again, 15 to 10 minutes, then in terms of refueling, you won't have to be as precise as potentially some of the players in whatever sport it might be, who might be playing again a few days later and need to try and restore that glycogen that they've lost as quickly as possible. It's likely just resuming your normal eating patterns. You'll consume more than enough carbohydrate to make sure you're refueled before your next competition.
Then Ian, if I just pass it over to you, if you think about like different positions, I know we've had some conversations about this before, maybe some of the carbohydrate mouth rinse work might fall into this. Like, do you think different positions, say for example, football players, they might need different recommendations, or could carbohydrate mouth rinse be beneficial for certain positions on the pitch?
Yeah, potentially. I think that work needs to be done to kind of substantiate it from a scientific perspective, but certainly maybe the goalkeepers in particular may benefit from when they can take a break or get access to their drinks bottle to rinse their mouth briefly with carbohydrate periodically, just to potentially maintain mental focus and certain aspects of skill. But you know, certainly for any outdoor on pitch player, then we need to encourage carbohydrate and fluid ingestion those whenever the opportunity may present itself.
Thanks. And another question that's come in, quite interesting. I've never really thought about this before. I don't know if the research has been done, but does the temperature of the fluid matter when you're carbohydrate mouth rinsing?
Yeah, another great question. It's not been looked at systematically, so we don't know. But you would imagine that it may have an effect, and then it may depend on the environmental temperatures you're competing in. So, for example, we know that mouth feel, if you like, or has a very has a big impact on the perception of the beverage acceptance from the athlete. So certainly cooling the beverage before mouth rinse would be preferential. In the studies that we have completed previously, we simply served the mouth rinse at room temperature. But I'd imagine during exercise in the heat or in normal conditions, then cooling the beverage may have certainly be more acceptable for the athlete to the mouth rinse versus a warmer beverage.
But maybe also quite difficult, especially if you're exercising in very hot temperatures, to try and keep that beverage cool. A couple more questions, and we're nearly running short of time. But obviously, people or athletes of any level like to follow specific diets. What's the recommendations for athletes that may be potentially following a ketogenic diet? Ian, maybe I'll pass that to you first, and then follow on to Tom after for any inputs.
Yeah, again, we haven't done this. If we think about carbohydrate mouth rinse specifically, again, and the benefits of following a ketogenic diet could be debated for endurance performance per se anyway. So we haven't done the studies where people have gone through prolonged absence or abstained from carbohydrate for a long period and then induced and then tried a carbohydrate mouth rinse strategy. We could speculate that perhaps the performance effects could be amplified given the low carbohydrate status, but we just haven't done those studies yet.
Tom, anything to add on that topic?
Yeah, I suppose just like Ian alluded to, it can be debated about what's going to be best, whether a ketogenic diet is going to help endurance performance. And I would say in the last few years, Louise Burke at the Australian Institute of Sport has led some really nice research into that way to look at how a ketogenic type diet might help or hinder performance. And I think after a few studies now quite conclusively show that at the elite level and to get to really high intensity exercise performance, then a high carbohydrate diet is necessary and a high fat diet is likely to impair performance. And I think, Louise would say herself that more research needs to be done. I would definitely recommend anyone to read those papers, but they quite conclusively show that at the elite level, it does seem that carbohydrates are still going to be the main choice and that ketogenic diet isn't preferred. However, having said that, it will depend on individuals' goals and their preferences. And of course, there's several people who aren't necessarily at the elite level, or they're doing exercise that is shorter duration, perhaps less reliant on carbohydrates. And for these individuals who works for them, I don't see any reason why ketogenic diets might not be, even better from a psychological point of view for them. Whether it is from a physical is another question, but for sure, I think they do have a place for some individuals. Whether they do for ultra endurance athletes who might benefit from being able to utilize more fat stores is again a big question that crops up a lot. And I think Louise does some work in her papers to try and discuss this. As of yet, there's no good evidence that suggests it will. So I think that's something to take into consideration. But like I said, I think ketogenic diets do have their place for certain individuals. And if they work for you, depending on what sport it is that you're doing, then I don't think there's too much of an issue.
Yeah, I definitely think that we need more research in this area, though, before we can start making firm conclusions. Just one really quick question before we wrap up. Maybe either of you can jump in and answer it. Will the intensity of physical activity hamper the absorption of nutrients? Anyone willing to go for it?
Yeah, I'll start, Rebecca. Of course, it depends on the duration and intensity of exercise. Certainly, when you get if you exercise at very high intensities, there will be a diversion of blood away from the gastrointestinal system towards the exercising muscles, and this results in a hypofusion of the area. Now, this could delay or impact on the ability of the nutrient absorption. So during very high intensity exercise, it will impact on carbohydrate or nutrient absorption. But paradoxically, early research or evidence would suggest just the ingestion of small amounts of carbohydrate may actually help preserve that gut barrier function during high intensity exercise. So the hyperfusion experience doesn't lead to significant damage to the intestinal wall. The ingestion of small amounts of carbohydrate may actually benefit or help protect the gut during that type of exercise.
Do you think that's also goes back to one of Tom's points in his presentation about, practicing in training and trying to train the gut? Do you think that's kind of related as well?
Absolutely. It's so important to work towards those guidelines, and we know that actually following that advice periodically during training will actually enhance the absorption of carbohydrate in the gut and actually lead to superior feelings of gastrointestinal comfort during exercise if you practice. And from a performance perspective, that actually results in improved exogenous or carbohydrate oxidation in the muscle. So it's certainly a key point or take home from today's session.
Yeah, practice is key. I will take that home with me today. So we've only got 1 minute left. I think that's all we've got time for. I want to just thank you both so much for the time to speak today and to answer the questions. We had like a good 30 minutes of discussion, so it's great. I hope everybody who has dialed in has enjoyed the session today. We are continuing with the webinar series. We have another one in 2 weeks, and that will be on sports nutrition and recovery. So we're covering another important topic of sports nutrition. So please sign up using the link that you used for this webinar, and I'll look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. So Tom, Ian, thanks again so much, and thank you everybody for listening.
Thank you.